What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim, and we are going to be talking about state of the Northwestern Wildcats. Before I get to my guests, just a reminder, make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, send me emails at big10footballtalk@gmail.com. We are just a couple weeks away from the season, so you won't want to miss anything. But without further ado, my guests, Jon and Scuzz from the West Lot Pirates podcast, representing the Northwestern Wildcats. Gents, how you doing tonight?
Not bad. Feeling a little guilty that it's taken you this long to get us on. That's not your fault. That's our fault. Schedules. And we appreciate you working with us because we're really happy to be here and we're always trying to find time.
No guilt necessary. We got it before game one, so that works. So we got it in. So how about you, Scuzz? How you doing tonight?
I'm all right, man. I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Thanks again for having us on.
For sure. And you guys are saying pre-show, this is your first college huddle engagement. And
Yes.
So welcome to the huddle. Of course, we're all part of the college huddle community. But you guys have lived as a podcast, as an entity, for a lot longer than the college huddle. When did you guys start?
So we got started during bowl season after the 2010 college football season. So we've been doing this thing this is, I guess, season 14 for the Wildcat Pirates.
We mapped it out over. The missing man here is Sam Walter, but the three of us mapped it out over cigars at Scuzz's wedding many, many moons ago.
There you go.
And suddenly we look up and we're headed into year 14 here.
That's awesome. Okay, so it was at the wedding. How'd you guys come up with the name West Lot Pirates?
So all of us graduated in the early aughts, and we've been tailgating together in the West Lot of Ryan Field, right about.
Yeah.
In fact, you can actually see our pirate flag in this blown up photo. But we started tailgating there in 2004 roughly, and I can't exactly remember why, but we started flying a pirate flag in addition to the Northwestern flag at our tailgate. Some of that is just baked. Like Sam and I were both in the Northwestern marching band way back in the day.
No kidding.
Yep.
Scuzz was drum major.
I was. Yeah.
What? That's awesome.
Yeah. So our origins are pretty cultish, frankly. in that way. But pirates were a thing that came up frequently in marching band, and it was always a pet affectation of our friend group, etc. Anyways, we started flying a pirate flag. And when we got together, after the wedding to really put the nuts and bolts together on the podcast, which also featured a trivia victory at a random soccer bar in Chicago over a team from Harvard, which we're pretty proud of as well.
That's
right.
You absolutely should, by the way.
The combination of the pirate flag and then the West Lot, the other component of it is that somewhere in those 10 years of tailgating, we switched from your traditional black pirate flag to a red pirate flag. Because that was the flag that was flown if you were a pirate that gave no quarter, i.e. gave no mercy.
Yeah. So, and then the other irony being we were in the West Lot for years and then for a variety of reasons have been itinerant and have been in just about every other lot that you can tailgate in around Ryan Field. And then in the past couple of years, actually settled in the north end of the East Lot, which is kind of where what's called Wildcat Alley, where they set up a lot of events for the kids. It's where the band performs pregame and things like that. So we've ended up there for, it's maybe like 2 or 3 years in a row. And now, of course, everything's going to get thrown in a blender again because of everything that's happening. Like even as we speak right now, we don't 100% know exactly how the tailgate situation is going to look for this coming 2 years. We have a pretty good idea. But with us being on the lake and everything, I mean, credit to Northwestern, like they've thrown this together as quickly as they could, given how crazy this time frame's been. But we're still figuring it out. And then beyond that, brand new stadium, brand new lots, and we'll settle into whatever the future is going to be. But we'll see.
Yeah, that's an empty parking lot.
Exactly.
It's been cleared out. It's pretty shocking to see it in real life.
Huh. Yeah, and we'll talk about that more in depth as we go on, because that's a big storyline this year is teams coming to the lake to play, or Wrigley Field, at least in the case of my Buckeyes. So,
Yeah,
well,
they weren't gonna stick you guys with the lake.
But I'll tell you, the Wrigley Field, those tickets are a pretty penny right now. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I know off air we were talking about how crazy last year has been, not just for Northwestern football, but for all of Northwestern sports. Obviously, year one of football was crazy in many ways. Year one for David Braun, following the loss of Pat Fitzgerald. Can you explain what all happened to turn really a terrible situation into this unexpected triumph of an 8-5 season?
I mean, it was shocking for us, frankly, as well. I think when we previewed the Cats, we kind of finally got to that at the end of the summer last year. You know, we saw some pieces, but there were some pretty clear deficiencies. When you looked at what had worked the year before and what the team was bringing back on paper, it looked like we were going to be super green and light on the defensive line. That is a recipe for disaster in the Big Ten. We had some really interesting, awesome players coming in on the offensive side from outside the program. The fact that Ben Bryant, AJ Henning, and Cam Johnson all stayed true to their commitments and came to Northwestern was a huge factor in the team turning it around. And but at the same time, we still had Mike Bajakian, which we were stunned, frankly, that he had been retained by Pat Fitzgerald after the previous season. So it just felt like this weird blender of, we don't know quite what we're going to get. Maybe this team coalesces and finds some purpose and some camaraderie and drives through, but we felt like some of the fundamentals were going to be problematic. And then, real talk, David Braun is a hell of a coach, and I think it shined a spotlight on some of the real deficiencies that our prior coaching staff had been guilty of, particularly the defensive coordinator, Jim O'Neill, who had been with us for 2 seasons and probably represents the bottom of the barrel in our time covering.
Wow.
Yeah, I think to illustrate, if I can give you an example that kind of illustrates what Scuzz is talking about. So if we look at the Las Vegas Bowl, which the bowl that we beat Utah to end our season this last season, the defensive line as a whole, that was kind of the culmination of the year for them. They were a unit who got better and better and better all year for a number of reasons, all related to what Scuzz is talking about. But a couple of them went off in that game. But 2 guys who absolutely just obliterated the Utah offensive line in that game were Anto Saka and Kenny Soares Jr. And Anto Saka's a defensive end. Kenny Soares is kind of like a hybrid. He's, I guess, nominally a linebacker, but he was used in pass rushing situations a ton. In the 2 years that preceded David Braun, those guys don't have a home. What I mean is the way that the defense operated in those 2 years, Kenny Soares would be a tweener, and a tweener in the old system just didn't play. We want a 6'5", 240 linebacker. That's not you. And we want a 6'6", 285-pound defensive end, and that's not you either. And the fact that you're a dynamic, game-changing player, well, the system is rigid. The system is inflexible. The system doesn't adapt, so you don't fit there. And even a guy like Anto Saka, who was at times a dominant defensive end, okay, was a guy who would have been kind of without a home too, because he's more of like a pass rush specialist kind of guy. And we were in a situation where we only played for like 2 years. We played only a select group of guys, and those select group of guys had to fit someone's vision of a system that was pre-written before the start of a season and then not changed in any way, shape, or form, despite whatever was playing out during the season. Okay. So it's not just that not nearly enough guys played. It's that a lot of times they weren't necessarily the right guys and they weren't played at the right time. And then in comes David Braun, and not just David Braun, defensive coordinators like Christian Smith, who we got from South Dakota State, who are just like, we're playing everybody, and basically being like, we're going to play situational football on a down by down basis. These guys who are playing chess, being like, who's like on this down, who are the best guys we can have on the field this situation, and how are we going to deploy those guys in the best possible way to succeed? And then next down, it's going to be a different combination of guys. So we
heard from some parents who talked about, like, they shared with us what they were hearing from their kids was that under the old system, these guys were totally out of gas by the fourth quarter. They just their rotation was really shallow. There was not they weren't being leveraged and during the course of the week, during the course of the game, in any way, shape, or form. And then the following season, that fast under Braun, they felt like they had a full tank of gas at the end of games.
Wow.
So, like, another example, like in 2021, we had the worst run defense in the entire Big Ten, with 13 linebackers on the roster. 3 linebackers got 95% of the snaps that season for the worst run defense in the Big Ten. They tried nothing. They adapted and evolved in no ways. And that, like, the more and more I look back at it, there was an echo chamber that kind of, ricocheted across the entire coaching staff. And it goes back to years where Northwestern was very successful and trumpeted a coaching staff that hadn't changed in a decade.
Yeah.
And, like, I'm not suggesting that was a bad thing at the time. It was good in many, many ways, especially for the school. But as a couple of the key components of that coaching staff left and they were replaced with similar minded, similar sourced guys, you had this group that couldn't adapt to the new modes of college football and just kind of got stuck.
Yeah. That, I think that's really helpful, because I don't think anyone would think that Pat Fitzgerald was not, like, one of the great coaches in Northwestern. Like, at least I would think so. Would you agree that he's one of the best coaches in Northwestern history?
So, I mean, first of all, yes. And second of all, what's really key to understand is Pat Fitzgerald's one of the great, from a football perspective, one of the great program builders ever. Went to the school, gets the school, gets the kind of guys who are likely to come play football for the school. Not interested. Michigan wanted him. He didn't leave. He was interested in sticking around. And you had someone who, and then of course, in so many ways, he came to embody not just the football program but the university, and all those things contributed to building a program. Then Pat Fitzgerald was never, like, no one would ever accuse him of being a great X's and O's. Like, he was never considered to be like one of the great X's and O's scheming guys. And if anything, if you look at the coordinators that he had for a long time, they tend to be based on guys he had personal relationships with, personal trust with, guys that he believed were going to believe in the program and not stay. And sometimes, and this is what Scuzz was kind of talking about, sometimes with a guy like Mick McCall, you end up with this unbelievable defensive coordinator who's a perfect fit, and he's there year after year after year, and that stability really pays dividends. And other times it ends up like we had a situation where, from an offensive coordinator perspective, we were just mired in a rut for really close to a decade. And that so much of that had to do with just, we weren't going to change, the system wasn't going to change, and that there wasn't that impetus there. And now, kind of taking it back to where you started, it feels like it's just a brave new world. It's these young coaches who come in from the SCS who are just like, everything's on the table, everything's in play to play, down to down. We're trying it all.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you bringing up the FCS, because going back to the players that maybe didn't fit the prototype of each position. When you're in the FCS, you gotta deal with what you got. And sometimes you get, Pat Fitzgerald, even the great coaches. As a Buckeye fan, I saw it with Urban Meyer. I saw it with Jim Tressel a little bit, where you start to get stuck in your way of thinking and you kind of forget how to think outside the box. And it sounds like what you guys are really bringing to light. David Braun is not stuck in that thinking, because for years, as the defensive coordinator for North Dakota State, he's thinking, okay, to win a national championship at the FCS level, I got to, throw the kitchen sink out and figure out what's going to work. And he's willing to do that. And so it just seems like that was a jolt of energy for this program. especially with where Northwestern typically sits from a talent perspective. So that's just really helpful, I think, for us to understand.
It dovetails with honestly how Fitz was when he first became coach.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, he was the youngest coach in the Big Ten, maybe one of the youngest in the country. And he had to do exactly that, like figure out how to make it work with what he had. And there's stories of like Zeke Markshausen is a walk-on wide receiver that nobody had heard of, that our coaching staff turned into and schemed into like one of the leading receivers in the Big Ten. Austin Carr is another example of this, a guy that was a runner-up for the Blitnikoff. And like, whatever it was, they lost it over time. And I think you've seen this with other coaches, right? Like Les Miles is a guy that comes to mind who was incredibly successful and ultimately struggled to adapt. We could go on for a long time. There's organizational factors here of like, if you're a leader and you're so successful that there's nobody else in your organization that can give you feedback or guidance or push you or hold you accountable sounds like a little too punitive, but the thing that we love about Braun as he's assembled his staff, and this is true even coming into this season with the hire of Zach Lujan as offensive coordinator, he's hiring from his arch nemesis when he was at North Dakota State. His D-line coach and his OC are from South Dakota State.
Yeah, there's this view like they're all buddies because they're from the FCS. That's not how it is at all.
These guys have been like vying against each other and adapting to each other for years, and now they're working together and starting to understand, like, well, what was it you were doing 3 years ago that made me do X, Y, or Z? You've got Armand Binns, a guy that was a great wideout at Cincinnati. I forget where he spent his first couple of years coaching, but he came in, made an immediate impact, replacing a wide receiver coach that we had for 12 years who couldn't really develop or get much out of the room. It's not just Braun; it's been the whole staff. Frankly, Fitzgerald and the AD get a little bit of credit because they started some of. They brought Braun in, they brought in Binns, they changed the offensive line coach a couple of years ago. Like they changed the defensive line coach going into last season, but Braun has really embraced that opportunity to pull together a collection of thought leaders and rivals and young coaches that are pushing the envelope. And that's as a Northwestern fan who knows that we are never going to have the athletic advantage, the recruiting advantage, you have to find some other edge. And this seems like a pretty damn good one to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think that really leads to where I want to maybe take us next is you were mentioning the excitement for this season. You guys are coming off a very unexpected 8-5, but like you guys beat Utah. Utah's like a favorite to win the Big 12 and make the college football playoff, and you beat them in the bowl game. So like
we've beaten them in a bowl game twice.
Yes. And so what's the expectations now for year 2?
I think Scuzz, we were talking about it, but the goal is a bowl. And I think, you were talking about it when, you were presenting questions you were interested in and saying like, hey, like you guys, you've got 2 teams that played in the national title game on your schedule. You've got Michigan and Ohio State in back-to-back weeks. You have to go on the road to Iowa. And I think if you frame that to a Northwestern fan is thinking, well, yeah, we can remember like the few but important hallmark moments when we beat Ohio State and Michigan, but that's not really part of our calculus here, right? Like on the other hand, like we're looking at Washington and again, like there's just a lot of tea leaves. Like we like that game. Like we're not saying that like, oh, we're going to win that game, but we kind of like how things are matching up there. And like, we're excited about that game. And then in the case of Iowa, and you say like, oh, you have to go to Iowa. Like we dance with Iowa every year. We've danced with Iowa forever. It's like Iowa and Wisconsin. Like these are teams like we could write a doctoral thesis on these teams every year. Like we know them like the back of our hands. Yeah. You know what I mean? So that like we're looking and being like, hey, like we know exactly what's going to go down when we trade blows with Iowa. We see it every year, right? Ohio State and Michigan, whatever. We're looking at all of those other games that there are. So for example, we're in the middle of doing all these summer previews that we do every summer. A ton of our discussions focused around like Miami of Ohio, because in a projection for a bowl, that's a kind of win we're looking at. and we're like, and a lot of people that probably are outside of the program are not focused on that game. That's a huge game for us. That's like maybe the best team in the MAC, one of the best, maybe with the best defense outside of the Power Five. And we have to deal with that at home in week 1. And that's a win that we need. So it's like, those are the kind of calculations Northwestern fans are making. Because our goal, is a bowl, like 6. Yeah. Anything better than that is great. But we're trying to keep the momentum going here. And it's games like that we're looking at as huge.
The crazy thing is that Northwestern hasn't seen 2 consecutive successful years in forever, not since 17 and 18. So right. we've been up and down, and I mean, 18 we won the Big Ten West, 19 and we finished last. 20 we won the West again. 21 and 22 we were last. Last year was this wild. I mean, it's literally been a roller coaster.
Yeah, last year, and then last year we're talking about won the West. For anyone outside the Northwestern family who doesn't know, we were a 52-yard field goal away from playing for the West the second time. That's the Iowa game. We lost to Iowa on a 52-yard field goal, and that's the difference between. I mean, we would have gone to overtime. We liked our chances in overtime against Iowa, and that's the difference. We would have won the West again. So it's that, but it's that whiplash is that's what we're dealing with year to year. Like Scuzz is saying, we're trying to string 2 good years together.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. There's an irony because you guys are talking about knowing Iowa pretty intimately and like, oh, we know Iowa, they're fine. I have nightmares of Iowa at Iowa because I think the last time we were there, we lost 55-24, and that was after we beat Penn State in a thriller. So it makes sense that you guys are like, we do that every other year. It's fine. I have a little bit more trepidation, I think.
I mean, it's not that we're not. I mean, they're. I mean, I'm telling you, we just previewed them. They're rolling out an NFL defense again for like the 10th straight year. I'm certainly not looking forward to playing them, but it's just the familiarity is there.
Yeah,
I mean, but like in the way that Iowa is, a thorn in your side as a Buckeye fan, we are the thorn in Iowa's side as Northwestern. I mean, Wisconsin more so because that series is actually like dead even over the last 25 years. But I like the last 2 times we were at Iowa, we got smoked there in 22, but in 20 we beat them.
Yep.
In a really tight game, a year when they were good on both sides of the ball, frankly. So I like Jon said, we know who they are and what to expect from them. I mean, the Big Ten West hysterically has been this, like mud fight, right? For however many years that nobody comes out of there smelling like roses, and Northwestern has benefited greatly from that. It's going to be kind of a weird situation not being in those divisions, but I think at least for this year, next year, the Wisconsins, Iowas, Minnesotas, Purdue's that's really still our wheelhouse and who we can most easily compare ourselves to.
Yeah, that makes sense. You guys are talking about, your wheelhouse, and, Miami of Ohio is a big game. Duke is a big game for you guys. I think as I was looking over the roster, I still have concern about talent. What has Braun and his coaching staff done to upgrade the roster, especially with this new world of the Big Ten?
Well, so first of all, I want to say one thing about this, and not because you're the only one who's asking this question. I think a lot of people are asking this question, but from our perspective, new Big Ten relative to us, if we look at just this season, the only quote unquote new Big Ten team we draw is Washington, right?
Yeah.
And here's where maybe because we're the long-standing purple team in this conference, they're the new purple team. But let's just put it this way. Washington turns over literally their entire offense.
Yes.
And their 4 best defensive players. And I don't feel like they're fielding a lot of, what are you doing to upgrade your roster for the new Big Ten questions? That's the kind of question that Northwestern gets. And it's just like, that's where it's the kind of thing where it's like, I mean, from our perspective, right, at least for 1 year, the lay of the land doesn't change too much for us. It's Washington, and it's a Washington team that's basically an entirely different team in almost every conceivable way from the team from last season, right? Like they're doing it from the ground up. Whereas we're kind of like, look, like we're kind of with a couple key differences that I know we're going to get to. We're running back a ton of the pieces from last year on a schedule that looks a ton like what we played last year, you know? But beyond that, I think a huge piece of it is like we're going to be previewing Northwestern in depth, like in the coming weeks when we look at it, but kind of going to something we talked about earlier, like last year when I previewed the defensive line, I spent a great amount of time talking about two guys who were both pretty big recruits, two big defensive tackle recruits that we had coming in as true freshmen last year. And based on what had happened the previous 2 years, I was basically like, look, these are pretty big recruits and they have to hit right away, or we're not going to have, or we're just going to be totally sunk. And then what happened? This revolution in the way guys were used on the defensive side of the ball. Coming into this season, I can go, let me just see if I can do it off the top of my head. Anto Saka, Aiden Hebert, Carmine Bastone, Najee Story, RJ Pearson, Brendan Flakes, Scuzz Topic, Kenny Soares, who rotates down onto that position, Jaden Cameron. I'm trying to think. I mean, there are more guys. Sean McLaughlin. These are all, I could name like 12 guys who played meaningful, important reps last year who are back. And that doesn't include the two guys that I talked about last season. It's literally the two guys who I talked about last season. They're both a year older now. And I'm like, I don't know how much those guys are going to play, because there was this revolution in the way talent was used on our roster last year. And now I'm like, well, we're going to play like 14 guys across the defensive line. So from our perspective, it's like, I don't know that it's so much that the talent is changing, but we feel like the level we're getting out of it suddenly just went through the roof.
Yeah.
Just feeling like a lot better.
Yeah. I feel like this is where there's like a national perspective, or even a conference perspective of Northwestern that kind of misunderstands the nature of the roster, in that, and there's one glaring exception, and it's the quarterback. So we'll come back to that, right? But outside of that, like, Northwestern has recruited quite well for years. We've been in the 50 to 60th ranked class pretty much every season, as long as like going back to 2013, like coming off of our first bowl victory back in 2012. That's the level we've been recruiting at. It's gone up. It's gone as high as, I think, the mid 30s, et cetera, once or twice back in 2015, 2016. But the point being is that there's solid talent on this roster when you look at the last 5 seasons and you factor in the mismanagement, the rigid scheme. Yes, we lost some really critical talent in the Pat Fitzgerald Braun coaching changeover, but broadly there's good talent on this team. The other thing I'll say is that those recruiting rankings are also undervalue Northwestern's talent, because most players stay at Northwestern for 4 or 5 years. Our classes every year are much smaller. When you adjust to an average star rating per recruit as opposed to like the class ranking, Northwestern is quite competitive with the Wisconsins and the Iowas, and is noticeably above the Purdue's, Minnesota's, Illinois', Indiana's of the Big Ten. So I'm not suggesting we're on par with Michigan or Penn State or Ohio State. We're not.
Sure.
Full stop. But I think there is more talent on the roster than has been recognized in the past. Braun specifically, this was a huge question when he took over. And then when they gave him the job most of the way through last year, it's like, whoa, like, yeah, this guy can coach, but is he really up to the task of running a Big Ten program? His first recruiting class did not look good. You can understand that, given the circumstances.
Right. That was something he inherited. Right.
Yeah. We're already seeing a much better class coming together for 25 that looks a lot more like the 22, 21, 2019 classes that Fitz was bringing in. I think the quarterback is another conversation itself. Like, that has been a huge failure of Northwestern since Clayton Thorson graduated in 2018. We have not identified or developed a recruit at that position. We're hoping that's going to change this year or next, as we look at Jack Lausch and some of the other players that Lujan and Braun are bringing in. But outside of that, like, every year when we dig through it, we feel pretty good. And when you look at the like AJ Henning deciding to stay for another year with Northwestern. That just speaks volumes to, a player with the pedigree that he had, the season he had last year. He could have gone any number of places if he'd wanted to look into that through the portal. But I think that to me really spoke something about the way this roster is coming together, the character of this program as it kind of starts anew and rebuilds. And I don't think any of us are concerned about that talent level outside of the quarterback position.
Yeah.
In these first couple of years, does Braun need to improve and with the momentum, et cetera, now that Oregon, USC, Washington are going to be in this conference year in, year out as the profile and the dollars that go to hires and recruits across the other teams in this conference? 100%. We've got to grow with the space we're in. But right now we feel okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think something I appreciate, even just as you guys are talking, is just the impact that Braun has had on the culture and like getting guys to stay. And I think that's been one of the ways that Northwestern has really been able to come up and get to the Big Ten championship game. And it Fitz, I think, established a really good culture. And I think Braun is too, where it's like, hey, this is a place where you can come, you can grow, you can develop, which makes sense as to why they can thrive even in a conference that has maybe the higher level teams of Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State. And
in another sense, also in the NIL era too. And this is like a key piece because so Northwesterners had a slogan, and I think Fitz coined it. I don't know 100%, but 4 years for 40 years. The idea being the value of a Northwestern degree and what it's going to mean for the rest of your life. And it's not lip service. And if we're going to think in terms of cold, hard value, cold, hard dollars and cents, there's a big monetary value to that. And the kind of families that Northwestern recruits, the kind of players who come to Northwestern, they intrinsically understand that value. So when we're doing NIL, and we know like Jacob Schmidt, who runs True NU, like the NIL collective, like we know him, like we know that organization, like we're involved in, we've been peripherally involved in different NIL efforts at Northwestern. And that stuff is all really important. But strictly from a football perspective, the way a lot of that is geared is basically being like, for a guy who doesn't have his Northwestern degree yet, that guy really doesn't want to leave. But if he's hearing about, hey, you could be making X amount of NIL dollars here, and that number is lower at Northwestern, well, he's going, yeah, but I want to get my Northwestern degree. So somewhere in the middle of that, there's a calculus where it's like, okay, when we look at NIL, we're thinking, look, what can we do to help this player who wants to stay, right? Because at the end of the day, he's a fool if he's not like, I don't know what to tell you. The gap is so big. Like that's money that could be a down payment on a house. That's money that could be like whatever. But at the same time, that same player is thinking, and my Northwestern degree is really important. So it's the kind of thing where, like, for example, this year there were a couple of players. Rod Hurd would be an example. Rod Hurd is a guy he graduated from Northwestern, played all over the defense for us, phenomenal player, played a full 4 at Northwestern. We have nothing but love for Rod Hurd, and he's in Notre Dame right now. And we would have loved for him to stay. We would have loved for Northwestern's NIL arm we'd love it. And I think this is everyone's goal, to continue to improve Northwestern's NIL arm to a place where we can offer more to someone like Rod Hurd. But on the other hand, Rod Hurd busted his ass in the classroom for 4 years and got his Northwestern degree, right? Tons of Northwestern students go get graduate degrees at other top universities. He went and did something similar for football after he got his Northwestern degree. So we don't begrudge that too much, because it's like, look, these guys tend to want to stay. They want to come in and they want to stay 4 years, get their degree. And we've got that much time to develop them and to use them.
Yeah. There's in the college huddle, I was having a conversation with Larry Crane, who runs Night Watch, the Rutgers podcast. And we were talking a lot about how important it is to build your program with a culture that really fits the program. So for Rutgers, it was, we're going to develop you the best, you stay 4 or 5 years and we're going to develop you. to be a tough, hard-nosed football player. You may not be a 5-star, but you're going to be a 3-star that develops into an NFL type player or a high-level player. It sounds like for you guys, that niche has really been solidified. It was solidified under Fitz, and it's really continued to grow, and which is really helpful because I think sometimes people, and I'll say, I think Ohio State fans are spoiled because, we sneeze and there's another 5-star recruit and you're like, oh, that's how you win. You get 5-star recruits. That clearly hasn't worked against Michigan the past few years. But like, that's not where you guys are. And that's okay because it's learning how. It's not like NCAA football, the game where it's like, well, you just got to get better and then you get 5-star recruits. It's like, no, I have to find my pathway to find success on the field, and it's not going to be the same for every program. And I just appreciate you bringing us into that calculus, because that is how Northwestern has been successful, has been establishing that culture. And they have been, like, I was at the 2018 Big Ten championship game and I was freaking out for 3 quarters because I'm like, Northwestern is giving Ohio State a much closer game than people expected.
That third quarter had your heart racing, didn't it?
Yeah. And then 2020, same thing. Trey Sermon completely saved us. Otherwise, we were going to lose to Northwestern that game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so when we preview other Big Ten schools, like, it's not just Northwestern. Like, culture and identity, I think is, to a degree, there are other, like, once you get into the Alabamas and the Ohio States and the Michigans, like, there are other factors at play. But for the rest of us, right, who aren't in that top echelon blue blood resource pool in college football, like the other 90% of us, culture and identity is the most impactful and the most ephemeral thing.
Absolutely.
For college football teams.
Here's a perfect example. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Scuzz.
Well, I was gonna say the example I was going to give just, conflicts with what I just said, because it's Michigan, it's Rich Rod. Mm-hmm. There's no reason that Rich Rod should not have been successful at Michigan and incredibly successful at Michigan. But it was a culture and identity misfit. You can go to Bill Callahan in Nebraska. You can probably talk about Scott Frost in Nebraska a little bit.
I was going to say, go to the west of us. There are 2 states out in the middle of the corn. And for the past decade, one of them has been a mess on defense, and one of them has personified excellence on defense, Nebraska and Iowa. And people talk about, like, the black shirts back in the day. But as long as we've been following, until it's changed in the past 2 years. But during the Frost era, and what ran right into that, there was this view that, like, Nebraska doesn't have their head screwed on straight, and they don't know what they're doing, and they're misusing resources, and they're not getting it done. And then you look at Iowa, and it was like, Iowa just gets it right on defense every single year. And that if it can be true, but if the perception is there, that 100% matters. And that goes to what Scuzz is saying, because recruits buy into it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if recruits are like, that place has a sick defense, then you're going to get more awesome players, because they're going to believe that they want to go into that. So it's like, culture 100% matters.
Well, not just the belief and the excitement, right? They're going to show up and know what their job is. That, like, it makes it easier for them to acclimate and to integrate and then to perform. The expectations are there. They can look like, oh, I want to be like that guy. I want to be like Micah Hyde. Mm-hmm. It plays out in so many different facets. And so it is something that has been useful and beneficial for Northwestern, and we do feel like we have that niche. It has not worked at the quarterback position.
That's a really good transition, Scuzz, because I think, you guys have brought out some of the key talent that's coming back, and there's more I want to ask about that. But the quarterback position is a big question mark. And, I was looking at the 3 deep that Phil Steele put out. It looks like Mike Wright might be the projected starter. But there's Brandon Lausch, there's Helinski, who is severely underwhelmed every time I've watched him play. What's your read on this room?
Go ahead, Scuzz.
So I'm going to use this a little bit to talk about the offensive scheme, because I think it's a really important component here.
Yeah.
most of us believe Mike Wright is going to be the starter. He's got a wealth of experience. He's, played at a couple different schools. He has not demonstrated himself to be an excellent passer. His primary, weapon is his legs. He's crazy fast. But he's also a veteran signal caller. Like he's been around the block, adapting, picking up, that role at Northwestern will be amenable to him, right? In a lot of different ways. Jack Lausch is, I don't necessarily want to say he's a carbon copy of Mike Wright, but for all intents and purposes, he's built in the same way. He's crazy fast. He made some epic plays last year with his legs. He has not shown that passing ability yet. Word out of camp is that these guys are actually pretty close to one another. Still, I think we're going to end up with Wright. So the hard part now is juxtaposing against the last 5 years. The 2 years that we were successful with this transfer quarterback situation were Peyton Ramsey and Ben Bryant last year. Yeah. Both veteran guys that played multiple years at other schools before coming to Northwestern. I think the system was probably complicated. You really needed that leadership component. Contrast that to Helinski, who, had a season in South Carolina, but that was it, one season. Hunter Johnson had been with Clemson for, I think, 2 years, hadn't really played much, but again, didn't have that veteran savvy to come in and say, hey, yep, I'm in charge and let's go. So as I'm reading the tea leaves, it seems like Wright is the likely option. We know that at Northwestern, especially when you've got a quarterback that runs, you're going to need more than one. Right. So it's pretty nice to see two guys that are built similarly. And this is where the scheme is so important. And I think what has us most juiced about this season is the hire of Zach Lujan. We could spend a whole podcast talking about former OC Mike Bajakian and his predecessor Mick McCall, and how like the life of our podcast has basically been like frustration about Northwestern's conservatism on offense in many different lanes and veins. But so Lujan being this young up and coming dude that has been at the forefront of FCS, running the offense at South Dakota State, uses a ton of motion, a ton of deception, a ton of modern concepts. When I hear Nate Tice on the Athletic Football Podcast talking about Zach Lujan and how excited he is to see what he can do in the Big Ten, like I jumped out of my chair when I heard that
wow.
At the end of last NFL season. So I guess that was around like draft time. They were doing some of those previews. But point being, when you look at what Lujan did at South Dakota State, everybody immediately thinks about Mark Gronowski, who was the FCS Heisman winner as the quarterback there, great passer, all the things. South Dakota State was number 3 in the FCS in rushing yards per game, 227 rush yards per game. Wow. And when I look at Mike Wright and Jack Lausch, we have not just speed, but depth of speed at running back. We have 2 guys that are super fast. We have AJ Henning, a couple of young wide receivers, and Frank Covey and CJ Johnson that are true speedsters. There's more speed on this Northwestern team than we've had in 2 decades.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Since Coulter and Mark, this is the most speed you can see Northwestern put on the field. It's just so much.
And when you couple that with Lujan, and again, this is we're into wishful thinking territory here, right? We hope this is what we see, but a deceptive running attack that can go in 7 different directions with a ton of really speedy guys and a clever coach that can disguise what he's doing, a veteran QB that can not only read pre-snap but read post-snap, and you've got a recipe for an offense that can improve on last year. That's what we're banking on. This is not going to be a bombs away, pass happy like when you think about New Hampshire or all the success North Dakota State has had at the quarterback position, or even Gronowski at South Dakota State. I think people hear FCS coordinator, that's immediately what they go to. Oh, this is a guy who just wants to take deep shots all game long. And yes, South Dakota State had the number 1 yards per attempt in all of FCS last year, but I think that is more of a product of a smart coach and the scheme and the way they're going to maximize players. And every interview that Lujan has given going into this season is all about well, I don't. It's not the scheme I'm going to run. It's not the playbook that I don't have a structure that I'm focused on. What I'm focused on is understanding the skill sets of my players and setting them up for success. And that is like music to our ears. And it's
I was going to say, when you hear Braun talk about it, he's light on specifics, but the words he drums home again and again are adaptable and flexible. And Northwestern fans, that's all we want to hear. We don't need any. Fine. I don't need any specifics. You had me at adaptable and flexible. My faith is in you. That's so.
Yeah.
That's it. It's important. It's important for me to say this. This is not going to be like a 40-point a game offense. I'm not suggesting that Northwestern is going to come out of the gates and blow the doors off of college football. But
sure,
can we get above the 22 per game that we scored last year? I think that's well within the cards. The question is, how high above can we get? And that's going to fall a lot on, Wright's ability to fit into the scheme, the development that Wright and or Lausch have throwing the ball, and then how the offensive line comes together. Those are the big questions, and we'll have to see how they go. But some improvement seems like a pretty solid
possibility.
I'll say another piece too with Wright specifically. Wright is a guy Northwestern recruited out of high school. He's a guy who went to Vanderbilt, which academically draws a lot of parallels, right? He picks a school different from Northwestern when he's coming out of high school. Then he transfers, and I'm sure Northwestern was in the mix at that point too. And he didn't transfer to Northwestern. He transferred to Mississippi State. So this is effectively the third time Northwestern has recruited Mike Wright. And I would say that ought to send a message that certainly in Mike Wright's eyes, the Lujan era holds a lot of promise. And then I think he's thinking the same thing that a lot of us are thinking, and he wants to get at this system.
Yeah, that's interesting. It even just the idea, like Northwestern has always wanted Mike Wright. They've always wanted him to be in this position. I'm now kicking myself for having done my record predictions before this episode.
Well,
we're homers, so
we're knocking wood just as furiously as you are.
Yeah, I will say, and it's something I had mentioned. This is the hardest year I've ever done season predictions, and part of the reason why, and you guys I think are bearing this out too, the floor in the Big Ten continues to rise, and it's encouraging because I'm like, I think there's some good rosters. And you guys are, I think, helping us see too. Northwestern has a improving roster, but I think Purdue. I don't think Purdue's going to have a great season, but I think Purdue's roster is getting better. I think Rutgers' roster is getting better.
Major believer in Purdue,
yeah. I have them upsetting Penn State this year at Ross-Ade because, and there's reasons for that, but like Hudson Card is a good quarterback. Dylan Thieneman's a monster on the back end of that defense.
Do you know that Purdue is one of only two teams in the Big Ten that returns both their quarterback and their offensive coordinator from last year?
I did not know that.
Illinois is the other team. That's preposterous. So it's not just that the floor is getting better; it's that the chaos and the turnover across all the teams is so huge that even just that small amount of continuity. The quarterback, their OC, they've got 4 returning starters on O-line. They've got Devin Mockabee back.
Yeah,
I think I called Purdue like my dark horse chaos team if the Big West still existed. But then we talked a lot about Rutgers when we previewed Rutgers. They look quite good with a beautiful schedule to match.
I was going to say, when you're talking about the rising floor in the conference, there's one specific thing that we didn't talk about yet that dovetails perfectly with this, which is especially so for anyone who doesn't know, every summer we preview every team in the Big Ten. We spend all summer doing it, and we do all these Big Ten previews every year. And as we do the prep for all these teams, I prep the defense, Scuzz preps the offense. And one thing that we used to, and this is where it goes back to like Nebraska. And there was like a whole 6-7 year period where every year I'm going like, Kirk Herbstreit thinks Nebraska's winning 9 games. And I'm telling you, they have no idea what they're doing on the defensive side of the ball. And then they'd win 5. And right now, there are just a lot of teams making a lot of smart decisions.
Yes.
And you talked about Rutgers earlier. You talked about having a Rutgers college huddle guy on the pod. And Rutgers quietly, and I think a lot of people didn't realize this, really became this home for linebacker excellence for like 5 or 6 years, where every year we would go, look, they are not perfect. They've got warts in a lot of different places, but they're churning out sick linebackers year after year after year. And their linebackers coach was just hired as Minnesota's DC. And that strikes a chord for us because we just promoted Tim McGarrigle, who has just been churning out all Big Ten linebackers at Northwestern. And we're like, that's a meritocracy in our eyes. In both of those cases, you're taking a guy who's one of the very best position coaches in this conference, right? And you're elevating him and you're being like, you've earned your shot at the next level. You're seeing guys, and then you have like USC stealing Deonton Lynn from UCLA and all these guys where you're like, or Indiana bringing in JMU's entire coaching staff, which minted excellence. Granted, at the Sun Belt, they're paying their DC $1.1 million a year to be the DC at Indiana. So you're looking around and being like, damn, a lot of teams seem to be doing a lot of smart things on the defense side. And you don't want to be one of those teams that's making dumb decisions right now, because a lot of teams seem to be making smart decisions. And like, I'm not going to call out any particular names, but like, there are a couple of teams that, like, certainly on the defensive side of the ball, where like, man, you're making some head scratching decisions, and you don't want to be the team that's doing that, because a lot of teams are doing some really good things right now. So again, I mean, I feel like we have to keep pace with all that, but I mean, and you know, I don't want to turn this into a Jim Knowles worship fest, but let's just say there's a certain team to the East who in a lot of ways could not get their head screwed on defensively for a long period of time, and now have found an absolute savior who is, I mean, hang on to him with both hands. That's
we're quite excited about the defense this year.
Yeah.
You know, and that was before Caleb Downs, and now we're just giddy. You guys talked about the defense quite a bit, at least at the defensive line. Any other names that we should keep our eyes out on?
I mean, Xander Mueller for us. I mean, again, we're biased. I think there is a certain defensive lineman in C-Town who I think even we would say is the best defensive player in the conference, and we would put Xander number 2. I think the people in Iowa would take their linebackers ahead of Xander.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't. To me, those are the 3 best linebackers in the Big Ten, and I wouldn't take Xander over anybody. It's not just the stats, and the stats look great. And this is a guy who was churning out stats 2 years ago for a horrible football team. He was one of the Big Ten West best linebackers. And then you look at the stats last year and you're like, oh my God, this guy's a monster. He was only 3rd team all Big Ten, as every Northwestern fan goes, yeah, no kidding. He was like 3rd team all Big Ten. But it's not just that. This guy made a game-saving tackle to help us beat Minnesota. He took down one of the best running backs in the conference, Darius Taylor, on a tackle we literally had to have. He made a crucial interception against Illinois. He won the game with an interception against Purdue. Every time you need a big play, he's there to make that play. He's just, for us, he is the apex. He's a perfect defensive player. So when we talk about, like, we returned 12 guys who played last year on the defensive line, we're factoring in, and then we've got this guy behind that group. Like, that's a starting place for us. It has to be.
I think the one other accolade for Xander Mueller that stands out is it's the breadth of his excellence. So he's a top 5 conference returner in tackles. He's number 2 in the conference after Kydron Jenkins in TFLs. He's top 7 returner in sacks, top 7 in interceptions. There's no other player that shows up across the board like that.
Wow.
And so when you couple that with the big play impact, the clutch moments that Jon's talking about, I don't know that there's anybody more comprehensively impactful.
I just, as you guys are saying, I have his stats pulled up: 110 tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, 5 pass defenses just last year. That's a stud right there. Certifiable.
3 picks, 5.5 sacks.
If you, I mean, and then in terms of players, like we said, there are so many different names we could throw out, like Kenny Soares, Antosaka, like we talked about earlier. Those are get after the quarterback type guys who this system finds a way to get the best out of those guys. In the similar vein, I guess if we're looking for like a deeper cut from people who might follow Northwestern, or certainly is a name people wouldn't know outside of Northwestern. There's a guy, Braden Bruss, who's a linebacker who, again, like there are multiple linebackers who are going to play in this unit this year. We might play 4, we might play 5. This is a guy who forced 2 massive fumbles on special teams, purely on pick coverage last year. Massive athlete, gets after the ball, crazy. And he's one of those guys where, again, in years past, we'd be like, well, man, this guy's not Patty Fisher size. How are we going to integrate him into the linebacker core? And now we're like, this guy's a weapon. And he's a weapon who's going to see the field more this year. I don't know exactly how he's going to show out, but they will find ways to integrate him because like they did it so well last year. So there's a bunch of guys I could throw out like that, but that's just one name. Like Braden Bruss is a guy who's you're going to see him in positional situations, down situations next year at linebacker, and he's going to get after it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. You guys talked about the schedule a little bit. You said the Washington game sounds good. As
we're interested. We're
interested in that game. You guys talked about Miami of Ohio being important. What's like 1 or 2 other games that you feel like are must-haves on the schedule for you? Like we know there's
I mentioned the FCS game and then wait for a lightning bolt to strike.
Stop that. I mean, like broadly, John said it earlier, right? Like Michigan, Ohio State. It would be amazing to beat those teams. We will 100% gear up for those games and be foaming at the mouth, etc. But like that's not part of the calculus. Those are, for all intents and purposes, off the board. At Iowa is probably too tough of a hill to climb. Though we know we're going to play them tough. We get Washington in week 4. It's not just all the players John talked about earlier. The whole coaching staff, they're pulling together Pete Carroll's kid and Bill Belichick's kid to run their offense and defense simultaneously. Like this is not a group that's been operating on offense, yes, but I just there's so many moving parts there. Do I think we're going to be that we're a favorite to win that game? No, but I think we all look at that team and we think this is more of a toss-up than anybody's going to give it credit. So we see nine winnable games on the schedule, including Washington. Washington's going to be tough. Miami of Ohio is going to be tough. Wisconsin is always a battle for us. Purdue is ascendant, like we talked before. We're not going to win all 9 of those games, but the idea of getting 6 or 7 of them feels very plausible. And again, we're going after that. Just get that bowl eligibility. That's success this year.
Right. And we're a team that I think a lot of Northwestern fans are familiar with situations where we're like, oh my gosh, we turned over so many guys this year. How are we going to deal with that? This year, it's pretty much quarterback or bust. We have tons of guys coming back. We cut together a highlights package to put up on our Twitter page last week. Just from AJ Henning and Bryce Kurtz highlights, you'd be like, holy crap, you're bringing both of those receivers back? Because it's just play after play after play. Joseph Hyman, Lujan himself pointed out, is a guy who averaged about as many yards per touch last season as anyone else in the country. It's just electric football players. If you can get a button pusher to make the offense go, whichever quarterback it is, but if that guy clicks, like we're looking at, like that's where we look at a Duke mainline, like wholesale changeover of the team, both sides of the ball. Washington, wholesale changeover of the team, both sides of the ball. We get those teams early. And that's where, again, we're sweating a team like Miami of Ohio, where we're like, damn, they lose like one guy to Oklahoma, that's like the kind of level that Miami of Ohio is operating at now. But it's like they return everybody else on their defense. So I'm looking, being like, well, shoot, that's week 1. But then I'm looking at Duke, looking at Washington, and being like, look, if quarterback clicks for us, we return a ton of guys. Just another random name. You asked another random name. In 2019, in an otherwise miserable year, we thumped Illinois behind a rushing attack from a converted safety playing running back named Coco Azuma. That was in 2019. Coco Azuma is going to start at safety for us this year.
No kidding.
And was a big contributor last season. So Coco's been around forever. But it's like we have guys who have just been in this program, for Xander being another, where it's like these guys who like we know exactly what these guys are giving for us. We've been with these guys for 3-4 years, and we've got a bunch of those guys. So it's like, if quarterback clicks, man, like, we feel good about a lot of this.
Yeah.
To answer your question on the games, Zach, more specifically, I think the absence of divisions this year really changes the Northwestern calculus, because I think the way this program operated under Fitz for a long time was figure your stuff out in September so that you can be solid to good in October, November, and win the conference. Or win the division.
Figure things out in September. Every Northwestern fan twitched a little with Scuzz.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm going to make them twitch some more. So I think, like, psychologically, more than anything else, like, and this is probably more for the Northwestern faithful than it is for the team, it's Miami of Ohio week 1 and it's Duke week 2. Those are the two that we got to have. We're better than both those teams. Miami's a really tough squad. We should have Duke's number, but this has been the absolute bugaboo for Northwestern for a decade, that they inexplicably drop stupid non-conference games in September. The all-time record between Northwestern and Miami of Ohio is 7-3 in favor of Miami of Ohio.
Wow.
They have the most recent win. They have the 7-3 record. They own the series in almost every way.
They beat us the week after Northwestern upset Notre Dame to open the 1995 season. The game that put Northwestern on the map, they lost to Miami of Ohio. This has been, like, obviously the guys on the team, even the coaches on the team, this is not on their radar, but psychologically as a fan base, those are the two games we got to have. That sets up the whole season and the positivity and the optimism that will fill what we think is going to be our awesome, really cool niche stadium, that will keep the fan base dialed in, that will help us all get, feel like collectively we're working towards this consecutive season of success for the first time in a long time.
Nice. Scuzz, you're like such an expert at segueing to where I want to go next.
Sorry.
No, it's great. It's great because you mentioned the stadium, the niche stadium. What it sounds like the vibe is pretty high. Describe like how you guys are feeling about it, having the temporary field this year and maybe next, but then getting the new Ryan Field. What's that all like for you guys?
Well, first of all, like, I think there is right now, certainly amongst Northwestern fans, we are very conscious of a palpable schism between how Northwestern fans feel about this stadium and how the outside world feels about this stadium, that frankly has Northwestern Nation a little pissed right now, because
I shouldn't have used the word niche, because I feel like that.
Yeah, I think there's this idea that everyone's like, oh, this stadium is like, oh, it's so ridiculous, and like 15,000 people and whatever. And it's like, the whole way we function is totally different. And we've been out on that lake where that stadium is. Every Northwestern fan's gone to lacrosse games at that stadium, and every Northwestern fan knows that it is an unreal atmosphere to watch sports. It truly is one of the greatest places in the nation to watch sports out at that field. So we're looking and being like, first of all, it's all front loaded. People are like, oh, you're going to be freezing out on the lake. These games are all in August and September. It's going to be beautiful weather out there. And the other thing is the calculus too. There's the only people who really get screwed in this situation are Wisconsin fans, who are the visiting team for one. Like, they're not going to get to come to a football game. Sorry, I don't care. Like, after that, it drops down to Indiana, which is not a traveling fan base, right? So it's like, from a number standpoint, the calculus wasn't there. Northwestern, if you look at the amount of fans, like, you're like, yeah, when we move into our new stadium, you're not trying to draw 15,000 people for a game. On the other hand, Northwestern's dealing with something that Northwestern never deals with, which is scarcity, right? That's actually a hot ticket. We have people contacting us being like, dang, like, got any tickets for Miami of Ohio or whatever? And it's like, so that's kind of cool. Like, you've built scarcity in. It's an unbelievable place to watch a game. And
can I just put that scarcity in context? Because I think this is a piece that the average college football fan like cannot wrap their head around, because Michigan, Ohio State, Tennessee, Alabama, it's all like 110,000 people. Like, that's that's what good looks like. The old Ryan Field was a 47,000 seat football stadium. And anytime we played a blue blood team, it was 60% filled with their fans. that is a miserable way to watch a home football game. Even if you ultimately win it. I'll never forget 2004 when we beat Ohio State, and it was probably 80-20. It wasn't 80-20, 70. I'll say 70-30 because that was, it was such a highly ranked Ohio State team. Northwestern hadn't done much that season to date, and so that, like the first thought we had when the stadium was proposed was 14,000 seats that are going to be 90% dominated by Northwestern fans is that's huge upside from where we were before. Number two, it is like the student section. They can literally roll out of bed, roll down the hill, and be at the stadium. And so we're looking at this as an atmosphere change for Northwestern football games. I mean, if you've been to Ryan Field, if you've been to a game there, it was never an overwhelming experience in terms of noise, in terms of fan solidarity, being on top of the field. Like, it just wasn't that type of place, right? And the opportunity here is for this Purple Palace on the lakefront. I have some friends who are seeing some of the aerial photos and things right now, not affiliated with Northwestern, but saying things like, you guys are going to regret not building your permanent new stadium on the lake.
Wow.
I don't know that's actually going to be true, but the other thing to think about is that the new Ryan Field that they're building, they're reducing that capacity from 47,000 down to 35. That's intentional to make a better experience for the fans that are in there, but B, also to build a lot of that scarcity and to keep some of those, no offense, Buckeye fans, Wisconsin fans, Michigan fans out of the stadium and give it a little bit more of a home field advantage. So from that standpoint, there are so many positives way beyond just the aesthetic and the beauty of sitting on Lake Michigan watching that game with the skyline in the background.
There's another piece of it too, which is, and this folds into a ton of stuff that we don't need to go into, but obviously for anyone who knows, in a lot of ways, Northwestern Nation, Northwestern fans have absolutely been through the ringer, right? Dating back to events that happened last summer. Don't need to go into it, but it's just been a lot. And then in the midst of that, kind of in the background, there was this whole trying to get the stadium pushed through, which kind of got slogged down in Evanston land use commission meetings and city council stuff, and dragged and dragged and dragged. And then when it finally got through, then it was kind of this question of, it doesn't look like we've really got it squared up where we're going to be playing. And then it quickly became like, look, it ain't going to be like 6 games in Wrigley. That's not feasible. And then quickly became, look, like when you actually break it out on a week by week basis, we can't do Soldier but 1 or 2 times. We can't do Wrigley but 1 or 2 times. Where the heck are we going to play all the rest of these games? And then you start looking at like SeatGeek Stadium in like the southwest suburbs and being like, that's not easy for anyone to get to, least of all anyone on campus. It's going to be crickets. No one's going to go to those games. It's going to be just a horrible environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then from that, a group of dedicated people in all different facets of the university. This is people on the board of trustees. This is like our friend Lake the Posts, a great friend to the whole Northwestern community, and other key people. Jesse Marks in the athletic department, but like a bunch of people really working to make this dream actually happen. And I think that Northwestern Nation was very much like when this got floated, like this idea of a temporary stadium where people are like, they'll never do this. This is never going to actually happen. And then
an idea.
And now we're all looking at pictures of it being like, I can't believe they actually made this happen. And that from this whole mess, we pulled this super unique thing out. And then for the football players, for their families to be like, they're going to get to have this. For like a guy who, let's say, plays 4 years at Northwestern and somehow never gets to play in the new stadium that's being built, that guy gets to be like, hey, I got to be part of the Lake thing for like 2 years.
Yeah.
So truthfully, go ahead, Scuzz.
A month before this plan came together, they floated the idea of playing a home game against Wisconsin in Lambeau Field.
It was. That's where we bottomed out.
And it was roundly rejected by the backlash from the alumni, from the season ticket holders.
That's good backlash.
Right? Goodness. But that's where we were at. SeatGeek is what, a 20,000 stadium. there's this other situation too, where so the Northwestern basketball, the much maligned historically Northwestern basketball program makes the NCAA tournament for the first time in 2017, right? And on the heels of that season, blow up the stadium. They play an entire season, a half hour off campus or further, maybe at All-State Arena out by O'Hare Airport, probably closer to 45 minutes away from campus. Just play to crickets, nobody goes, and the program kind of bottoms out as opposed to being able to build any momentum off of that season. Bottoms out, and it takes them another 7 years before they can kind of even get back to good.
Right.
And we're all looking at this stadium situation as this beautiful gift that is dropped in our lap to prevent that similar kind of experience. And it means we get to watch games in this really unique setting that a lot of people are calling niche or calling weird or calling whatever, but like real talk, like this is going to be cool as all get out.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you guys. So I'll be honest. I was ripping Northwestern for this probably 2 or 3 months ago on the Big Ten Huddle. I feel like I have been well educated tonight on why I'm wrong and why this is great for Northwestern.
Well, this is one of the things where we brought him up before, but it was the last year or the year before, we had Doug Lesmerises, who's a Buckeye beat reporter.
I love Doug.
Yeah.
He's amazing.
So Doug was on the pod, and one of the things we talked about with Doug, and we were so interested to talk about, is like, it's like saying the atmosphere around Buckeye football and the atmosphere around Northwestern football is apples and oranges doesn't begin to, because we were basically talking about when Doug goes to a presser with Ryan Day, he has to fight with like 20 hard-boiled reporters to get a question off. We have like 2 to 3 student journalists. That's what we're operating with. Oh, and our man Matt Shelton from Wildcat Report. Like it's a handful of people who just get to ask however many questions they want about like whatever they want. There's no point of comparison. And that's where we're like, anytime I'm like, look, Buckeye fans, you don't have the framework to understand this. It's not, there's no parallel.
Yeah. And it's just really helpful because I think it's a reminder. Like, I think that's true with other Big Ten programs too. And I think it's helpful to remember that from the holistic Big Ten experience. It's not just blue bloods. It's a lot of really good institutions that really love academics and love athletics. And just because a lot of other stadiums are huge, I think of Wisconsin Stadium, Kinnick Stadium, like in a sense, I don't know if these are good comparisons, but there's several programs in the Big Ten, Northwestern being one of them. Again, you have to operate differently and your needs are different than other programs' needs. And I think what's been helpful for me in hearing you guys process is to get fan engagement and to create the home field atmosphere is really paramount to this. And this is what it's going to do. And so while we're panning it from our elitist press boxes or whatever, you guys are actually building something really special. And so I appreciate you guys bringing me into that.
Yeah. I like throwing numbers out because I am a bit of the numbers guy on our podcast, but this is like, I've said this many times over the course of like my professional career, et cetera, just being a Northwestern guy, there are only 8,000 undergraduate students at Northwestern. It is a tiny school.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are plenty of schools. I'm sure Ohio State could, like 14,000 seat stadium. You're barely getting the student demand sorted there. Yeah. So like, I totally understand the reaction of like, wait, you guys are doing what? But if you haven't lived it and experienced it like we have, you don't see the positives off the top, and it's totally understandable.
Here's like, if Scuzz can hit it with the numbers, I'll give you like an experiential parallel. So Minnesota game, which was massive game. We were down huge to Minnesota in the second half this year, came back, won under the lights at Ryan Field. Truly one of the great moments of the season. Like in the wake of that game, Sam and I mean, tears in our eyes, running around because we know in the span of the next 10 to 15 minutes, we can talk to everyone who has touched this game in any facet. Like, we ran into all the journalists, everyone who covered the game, everyone who broadcast the game that night, got to feel them like they all just called the game of their lives, got to talk to all them, talked to all the kids who run the student section, who run the wild side, saw them in the wake immediately after that, went and talked to all the players' parents, and then caught the players coming out of the locker room and talked to them too, all in the span of 10 to 15 minutes. It's that kind of community. It's tight like that. And this stadium plays right into that. It's like, it's a small group, but it's a small group where everybody knows everyone. And that's like, for us, it means everything. So it's like, and we get it. Like, I know, like, right, for people where you're packing 110 for a game, it's not a frame of reference, but this is the way that our community operates. It means a ton to us, and this stadium's perfect for it.
We should give just a little bit of lip service to some of the problems with like, the logistics are going to be really hard. Parking is going to be tough. Like, obviously opposing fans are going to be like Jon has joked about the Wisconsin fans a couple times. They're the one like big traveling fan base that usually shows up in mass that will not get to play at Wrigley, like y'all. But the other factor that has been a bummer, like Northwestern came out with a pretty aggressive pricing strategy for these scarce tickets, and there's a lot of folks that we know who are feeling shut out. That is definitely a bummer. That is the biggest downside right now. But it's putting that aside, there are many other positives which we're obviously over the moon about.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, I'll get you out of here with this. If the few visiting fans that can come to a game would stumble into Evanston or to Chicago, where are we going for food? What should we make sure we get? What actual establishments should we go to?
Well, go ahead, Scuzz.
Well, I was going to throw out the two classics in Evanston to my eye. Like, if you're going to go to Evanston, if you're going to take in a game there, Mustard's Last Stand is the absolutely vintage Chicago hot dog joint / grill that is right next to the old stadium. Like, I could point it out on the map. It's in the lower right hand corner. It is still there, even though the stadium has been knocked down. Mustard's is still there. It's still operating. It's got signed pictures from all the awesome Chicago and Northwestern athletes over the years. It's an absolute classic. Go ahead, Jon.
It will be interesting too. Mustard's, I'm sure, in some capacity is going to take the show on the road for the next 2 years for football season. And that's not something I've thought about too much, but it needs to happen. It's going to happen. They're an institution. And like we talk about all this tailgate stuff that's going to be going out on the lake, Mustard's is a Northwestern football institution. I'm sure they will be transported in some form, but yeah, Mustard's is the classic.
Char dog with cheese, chili dog if that's your style, or just the classic Chicago hot dog. Just don't ask for ketchup. And then my personal favorite though is Buffalo Joe's. This is a wing spot that's been around forever. Was there when we were in school in downtown Evanston. The knock that a lot of people have on them is that their wings aren't crazy spicy. So if you want to melt your face off, like, this is not the place for you. But I think they're the best tasting wings I've ever had in my life. They're really good, and again, they're an institution that's been around forever.
That sounds amazing to me.
We should mention too, because you mentioned it before the pod, Chicago deep dish pizza. In terms of geography, I mean, there are the normal names, your Giordano's, your Gino's East. Northwestern Nation is going to be partial to Lou Malnati because Lou Malnati's grandson, Tino Malnati, played on the Northwestern basketball team, on the team that made Northwestern's first NCAA tournament appearance. So if you're going deep dish, the soft spot in Northwestern Nation's for Lou Malnati's.
Okay, I have a question for this because my wife and I, we toured Chicago. It was COVID 2020. It was in 2020. And we had both Lou Malnati's and Giordano's. If you had to pick one, which one are you going with?
Well, that's the bias right there. I'm gonna bleed purple.
I'm gonna be honest, neither. So
what?
So for me, I would rate Gino's East above those two, but this is not the place to go for deep dish pizza in Chicago is Pequod's. It is
okay.
It is in it's like in the west side of Lincoln Park. It's near Claiborne Avenue. They have a caramelized crust. It's a small joint. It originated out in the western suburbs, but this is like the inside baseball Chicago go-to spot.
Okay,
that is a real favorite. Like those other ones that we talked about are all really good, and they have a ton of different spots all over the city. But if you really want that deep local history, find yourself at Pequod's.
Pequod's. All right, I think I grew up in New Jersey. So like the New York slice was ingrained into me.
So I have a story that directly. Go ahead, say what you were gonna.
Well, I say I have become a huge fan of Chicago stuff. So much so I've learned how to make it at home.
Yes.
And I actually had Giordano's. I posted it on Instagram, and Giordano's like, "That's a good looking pie," and I'm like, feel like I've made it. I don't. That's the only time, but I made a deep dish pie and got a Giordano's comment. But go ahead, John. What were you gonna say?
Well, I'm a New Hampshire boy originally, and I'll always remember my freshman year coming out because I can eat, and coming out to my freshman year at NU, being like, "Well, I want to get some pizza," and someone's like, "Oh, you should get Chicago deep dish," and I'd be like, "All right, give me a large Chicago deep dish," and they're like, "Dude, for yourself, get a small." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Give me a large Chicago deep dish." And they were like, "All right, fine, get a medium. But when you eat half of it, you're going to feel really stupid." And I was like, "I'm going to be pissed when I get a medium, and I should have got a large." I got 2 slices in. I ate 2 slices of it, and I was like, I'm tapped out.
Yeah.
And that was my intro to deep dish pizza.
My opinion, Chicago is either the greatest or the second greatest eating city in the entire country. Like beyond pizza, like you cannot go wrong in Chicago.
And we'd be remiss not to mention that many Northwestern fans were excited this spring when they were shooting the bear up at Northwestern. Speaking of eating, like Northwestern somehow was factored into at least some of the shooting locations.
Nice.
You guys could go 100 times to the city and not uncover all the great eats. So I encourage you to make a routine trip or a return trip. Hit up Pequod's, grab some wings, find some Italian beef. That's the other Portillo's. Not in Evanston, but Portillo's is pretty can't miss down in the city as well.
Yeah. I'll need to, when there's a little bit more seating and the tickets are a little cheaper, then I'll make my return and get some food. So, well, guys, where can we find you, your podcast and on social media? Where are all the places we can find you guys?
We are in all the typical spots. So you go to Apple Podcasts, you go to Spotify. Is Google Podcast still a thing? We were there when it was. If it still is, we're still there. So any place you subscribe, listen to podcasts. We are an audio only venture, so we don't post video.
But we have a YouTube feed. All our audio is up on YouTube.
We are on YouTube. Just search West Lot Pirates. Everywhere you go, we're on Facebook. Twitter is our primary space of discussion and etc. But Instagram, Threads, all the above. We tend to post about weekly. Like John mentioned earlier, our summer previews are rolling out right now. We've got about another, I think, 5 of the 18 teams in the Big Ten to roll out over the coming week and a half before the first game. So
18 teams.
I know.
It's a lot.
It's been a lot.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, yeah, make sure you give these guys a follow. Jon, Scuzz, thanks again for taking, I told you 30 to 45 minutes. We're close to an hour and a half. So you guys have more than pulled your weight on this one. So
Only
I
way we know how to do it.
Here.
Thank you, man. Thanks. We really appreciate you having us on.
For sure. For the rest of you guys listening, thanks for listening. Take care and God bless.